afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. And first off, I would like to congratulate the faculty at the university for the continued good work that you do. Thank you. It's an important contribution to society. And then I must also add that it's not always going to be recognized. As just now, as one of the previous students, just now a previous lecturers in econometrics came to me and reminded me of my absolutely atrocious handwriting that I used to have at exams. So apparently that gave me some hard times. So a lot has been said about the financial crisis in 2008 and 2009 and the recovery, such huge recovery since. So instead today I would like to take a step back and look ahead for the next 5 to 10 years and express my personal views. What do I think are the 4 important themes that will likely play themselves out, that will shape the economic backdrop, and what are the implications for South Africa? And in a historical context, unfortunately, South Africa has not done that well. It's been nothing short of disappointing in terms of the economic growth achievement in the last 3 to 4 years in particular. If you see the black line, that shows you the average growth rate that we've had in the last 20 years. It averages around 2.5%. And yet, since 2012, 13 and 14 in particular, growth is closer to around 2%. In fact, more recently it's been less, and partly because of the strikes. But even if you take labor unrest in South Africa out of the pictures, you still only get to around 2% growth that we've had in the last 3 years. And of course, consumer spending, that yellow line, also slowed quite significantly from around 6% to around 2% more recently. And as a result of that, we have made no progress in terms of the unemployment rate. So I often see economic performance, economic growth as just a means to an end, and that end is to improve living standards, to generate jobs, to reduce poverty and unemployment. And in that context is really the most striking what has happened. The first bar here, you see that about 500,000 to 600,000 people start to look for work every year. 500,000 enter the labor force every year. And yet, per annum for the last few years, we've only generated around 100,000 jobs in the formal sector. And that means the rest, almost 500,000 people, either then have to take up employment in a much less well-paid informal sector, or then become unemployed, or even so discouraged you stop looking for work. And so if you can project that for another 10 years, you will have almost 5 million people that either then have to work additionally in the informal sector or are unemployed. So that's quite clearly a concerning situation that has many socioeconomic implications. So I would like to consider whether that is really still part of a very subdued recovery from a very damaging economic crisis, or is the economic backdrop itself changing? Are the next 5 to 10 years going to be different than what we had even before the recession, before the crisis? And so in my personal view, there are 4 themes that will play themselves out like in the next decade or so that we need to adjust ourselves to in order to be successful. And the first one of those is that growth in the world's second biggest economy, China, is slowing from about 10% average that we've had for 20 years to, according to the IMF, about 6% by the end of this decade. And you can see in the blue line it shows annual GDP growth. It grows rapidly, just ahead of the crisis, Then it slowed to around 10% in 29, 10, and 11. It was relatively resilient, but we know now that that was essentially due to policy support, kind of lower interest rates and supportive monetary policy, and a lot of fiscal spending that really helped the growth rate. And once that stimulus was unwound, growth proceeded to slow, and it's around 7 to 7.5% pace at the moment. So why is China growth structurally slowing after so many decades at a rapid pace? And there's essentially two parts to that answer. One is that the economy has to transform itself to a more sustainable model after a period of a high investment growth phase. And the second one is that the number of people of working age is actually peaking right now and will start to decline in the next couple of years. In economics, a declining labor force is quite a significant problem as well. So in addition to those two factors, productivity growth has also decelerated rapidly in China. So unfortunately for now, it looks as if that kind of slowdown will be sustained for another decade or more. The reason why we worry about China and why I highlighted is it's not just the world's second biggest economy, but it also has a significant impact on demand for global commodity prices. And on your left chart, you see the IMF commodity price index, and it tends to move together with manufacturing in China. And so slow growth in China will mean that there's downward pressure on commodity prices globally. But also more simply in the right table, China accounts for about between 40 and 55% of global commodity demand. And as a commodity producing country, commodity exporters are very sensitive to global commodity prices. And indeed, the drop in commodity prices last year and this year is one of the reasons why our current account deficit is still so wide and why there's pressure on the rand. And whenever there's a further kind of weak data point from China, investors become ever more concerned about South Africa and when it's able to finance its current account deficit at the current exchange rate, and therefore it kind of tends to exert some pressure on the rand. So many economists have estimated, in addition to the direct effect of China growth on the world, there's also an indirect effect that is relevant to countries such as South Africa, why commodity prices, that is actually way bigger than the first round effect. The second theme is more generally global growth, particularly in developed markets, has been disappointing. So when we look back since 1980, developed markets have grown at around 3 to 3.5%. But in the last few years, global growth has averaged closer to 2 to 2.5%. And increasingly we hear the words secular stagnation in the face of panic demand. We don't think that's all of the story, explains all of the performance. But what secular stagnation essentially refers to is a very long period of very low growth. And there's both a demand side aspect to it, i.e. when your debt levels were too high and you need to actually pay down debt, growth tends to be hard. And also from the supply side, population growth globally is slowing from about 1% to 0.5%, and productivity growth globally has been slowing from about 1.5% to 0.5%, according to the IMF data. Another way to look at that is to ask, where should the level of real GDP have been by now? Where would we have reasonably expected it before the crisis? So in developed markets, growth averaged around 3% in the 20 to 25 years before the crisis. And that trajectory is shown in the blue dotted lines right up here. And so by now, our GDP output on developed markets should be around an index of 130. Instead, the IMF estimates that the secular growth has slowed from just under 3 to just about 2. That implies that kind of trajectory here. However, unfortunately, growth has even fallen short of that kind of downwardly revised projection. The third theme, and I promise there's one positive theme right at the end. But for now, unfortunately, bear with me once again. The third theme, I think, is also very important for emerging markets because mostly we focus on developed markets and the progress that they've made in healing the economy since the recession. And yes, indeed, a lot of healing has taken place. But unfortunately for us, for emerging markets, much of that process of paying down debt is yet ahead of us and will play itself out over the next 5 to 10 years. What I'm trying to say is the debt levels, particularly private sector debt of households and corporates in developed markets, grew rapidly ahead of the recession and of course in many ways contributed to the recession. Yet after 2009, those households and companies and even governments made a lot of progress in reducing that debt. It was harmful to growth at the time, but it was a necessary part of the process. In emerging markets, in contrast, we have actually rapidly increased our indebtedness, our leverage ratio, since the recession. Why has that occurred at the same time that others have been delivering? And I think the intuitive part of the explanation is that in response to the recession, interest rates dropped in those countries, policies in general became more supportive of growth, and that spilled over into emerging markets. Also simultaneous with money flowing from developed markets to emerging markets. So that encouraged emerging market growth and encouraged indebtedness in emerging markets, and led to that leveraging up period here. So unfortunately, the gist from that slide is that emerging markets yet need to pay down the debt. That means increasing the savings rate and reducing the consumption. And in fact, in many countries, including China, economists are at times concerned whether they will manage to reduce that debt without resorting to default. Is there another bubble in some emerging market that could burst and be quite harmful for the subsequent decade or so? Of course, we're hoping that will occur. In South Africa, we've got some aspects of that, although it's not quite as persistent. We have paid down our mortgage debt since the crisis, and so we've made very good progress in that. But at the same time, we've also levered up in non-mortgage debt, as in vehicle, unsecured credit, overdrafts, credit cards. And that particularly happened the last 3 to 4 years. And that process of paying down that debt is also still ahead of us. And of course, this year we all saw the headlines of various lenders in that sector that were hurt. And there's a second aspect to that. Also in terms of government debt levels in South Africa have risen from around 25% of GDP to 45% according to National Treasury, and they will tick up yet a little bit further. But that means eventually we need to create a fiscal space and pay down that debt. So we have the scope again to react to the next recession. And so many have projected already next recession only being around 3 years away. So it's not my forecast, but it could well be. And we are, for now, ill-prepared for such a situation. And now the positive theme, as I mentioned, and hopefully one where we will increasingly feel the difference in our pockets in the run-up to Christmas. This one, perhaps the timing has been the most surprising. It's one where global oil prices, global petrol prices, have dropped around 40% or so since the middle of the year, from about $110, $115 per barrel to, in fact, today under 70. And what that means for South Africa is petrol prices should drop by about 2 to 3 rands, about 20%, 25% drop in petrol prices that we have to pay. And that stimulates consumption over the next 3 to 6 months, at least to some extent, as we have more cash in our pockets. So this relief to global consumers and SA consumers wasn't really projected, even just a short while ago. So what explains this rather dramatic fall? Part of it is lower growth in emerging markets, so less demand, of course, reduces some pressure on prices. But a significant part, oil production in North Africa and Middle East, indeed, has been reasonably stable and steady in some of the fears of supply disruptions they have faced. But at least half of the reason is the fact that we now have the US increasing its oil production quite significantly as part of shale gas liquids. And in doing so, it actually undermines the pricing power of the global oligopoly that we have in the market. We have a set of countries in North Africa and the Middle East that form OPEC that want to stabilize global oil prices at elevated levels, of course. But right now, they're not coming to an agreement to cut their own supply while other people's output is increasing, such as the US. And therefore, while that situation continues, oil prices are dropping. Now, eventually, perhaps early next year, OPEC may cut production a little bit to stabilize prices, but still, it would be difficult to see oil prices going back to the previous level. So, US shale gas or shale gas liquids is something that structurally actually changes the outlook for energy prices in the next decade. So we've spoken about these 4 themes that I think will really determine the global backdrop in the next decade with this new economic paradigm. Question is, what does it mean for us, and how should we react to it? As you have gathered by now, the first 3 are not really conducive to environment of fast economic growth. Indeed, both the SARC now as well as the IMF agree that economic growth in South Africa, in potential growth and in the longer term, likely only averages around 2.5%. What that means is, if you go back to the second slide in terms of employment, it is difficult for me to see a situation that is materially different than what I've shown you, i.e. 500 to 600,000 people that enter the labor force every year, and yet perhaps 100 to 200,000 formal sector jobs being created. And so that's a very challenging situation from a socio-economic perspective. It also means that it is difficult, of course, to see an improvement in unemployment rate. If anything, there's upward pressure in unemployment. So what can government do, and the SARC and Reserve Bank? In terms of monetary and fiscal policy, that means that interest rates globally, as well as locally, are likely low in a historical context. We probably will still see an interest rate hike or 2 in the second half of next year, even as some other emerging markets don't have to hike interest rates anymore. And the reason why we are different is because we have a relatively sizable current account deficit, i.e. we import a lot more goods than we can export, and the price of those export goods, unfortunately, have decreased over the last 3 years. So we need to continue to finance that to the extent that the global environment is no longer conducive to fast inflow of money and portfolio investments. We will continue to exert some pressure on the rand. We've seen that this week yet again, where the rand weakened versus the dollar quite a bit. It also means, in terms of taxes, that unfortunately we can't do all the work just on the expenditure side. There probably will be tax increases, both in the short term as well as in the medium term. In terms of personal income tax, in terms of value-added tax, in terms of more general wealth taxes. Because as we kind of earlier showed, that debt level of around 55–50% public sector debt to GDP leaves very little room to maneuver in a low growth environment with likely many more business cycles ahead of us. The most important implication from a policy perspective is really that as the external environment becomes even less supportive the next 5 to 10 years, as we struggle to get that global uplift, it becomes even more important to look at the domestic bottlenecks in terms of infrastructure, in terms of education, in terms of well-functioning labor and product market more generally. And so it's up to all of us here as well to contribute to make sure that we do not lose sight of the government's National Development Plan, the kind of policy initiatives in there that are implemented in the spirit and essence, and we must guard against cherry-picking the individual favorite aspects in there. My biggest concern in terms of the outlook the next 5 to 10 years is really in terms of social mobility being impaired even further due to this lackluster job market. And hence a highly unequal society is at risk of becoming even more unequal. And that may well lead to pressure for more regulation legislation, which will still fail to address the underlying problems. So Professor van den Berg, also from the economics department, has often written how inequality and social mobility is largely determined by the education sector and subsequent wage income. From a personal perspective, social conditioning, as in your social environment, social expectations, is also very powerful. I come from a very working class, not well-educated background in Switzerland, and so I stopped going to school at the age of 16 because no one else completed matric or completed high school. And it was just really the experience, the encouragement of one or two other people at Greenwich Girls' High at the university here that resulted in the ironic situation that exactly 10 years after stopping school, after dropping out of high school, I was doing the PhD at Oxford. So I would like to leave you with the quote that we have to create the South Africa that we want to live in. That as the environment globally becomes more challenging for the foreseeable future, and governments no longer having the fiscal space to undertake many of the policy initiatives, it is up to us to pay it forward where we can in terms of information, encouragement, time to those outside our circles to do our best to reduce inequality and improve social mobility.